Well, thank you very much. This is very consistent with the agenda followed by Chancellor Scholz with the Compact and Africa. And now give the floor to Olaf Scholz and thank him for being here and attending this conference.
Thank you. I think it's a very important meeting we have here and had yesterday. A lot of questions have been discussed, many proposals have been made, and they are all about the relevant question how we can fight poverty and give chances for development and how we can fight climate change. And we learned together and agreed, I think this was said by many, that this is not an alternative. It must be our aim to make it happen that we meet both challenges. As there are a lot of meetings where a lot of speeches are held, I think it is also important that we always walk as we talk. This is what you said, and I do agree very much. So it is always important that especially the more economically stable and successful countries do their contributions and that they stick to the things they say all the time. The first question, I think, is that we are sticking to our words, speaking about development aid and climate financing. There are a lot of aims that have been agreed on in meetings in the past following the Paris Agreement, and I think there will be more to come in the next years. But it is important that we do something, that this really works. And so just speaking about Germany, we will stick to what we do, being front runners in development aid financing and being front runners in finding international climate financing. And I ask all to participate in this because it is about walking as you talk. The second is that we have to do ourselves what we ask others to do. So if we understand it is a necessary aim that we fight climate change, and in the case of Germany we say that we will be ready with a CO2 neutral industrial country in 2045, this means a lot. Because being strongly industrialized, it's not just about housing or some forms of mobility or the electric grid, it's about industry. And that's a big, big change from today. And this is what we do. And we are now having a lot of aims. And one of them is in 2030, we will have 80% of our electricity production coming from renewables. This is just one aspect of all the things that have to be changed. But it is also a very good message to the rest, because if we do so, we are using and developing technologies that could be used cheaply in many other places. It is not in the end that sticking to using fossil resources is cheaper if we are successful with our technological advantages we are working for. And that is feasible now. It is not a question of the future, something to be done later. It can be done now. And so also in this case, we have to walk as we talk, speaking about these questions at conferences like this. There is a debate about the international financial architecture. And my view is that really we have to do something to work on the questions of reforms of the World Bank and the multilateral development banks. And there is this evolution roadmap where Germany worked very much with many partners for the World Bank and for the multilateral development banks. And I appreciate very much that so many are supporting this activity, including the new president. And I think this is very important because we need a change to have more money that could be used with just changing the way how these banks are managed and the framework for their activities. And if we do this very fast, this will have a very concrete outcome for many people. And I'm very happy that this is now going forward and is supported by so many. Secondly, I think we have to fight against the problems of nature crisis, coming especially from climate change, but not only. And if you are not a very rich country, it is much more difficult to face these crises if they are happening to you all at once. And because of this, I think it is necessary that we work together. And the global shield that has now been agreed should come into practice, and that we form something that gives countries that are in that desperate situation gets the necessary support because otherwise they will not able to work on this question. Working for against climate change is also something where we have to discuss with our businesses and our industries at home. And when we do so, they always ask us that we should give them security that when they follow the path, this is not a risk for them in competition with other countries. And yes, this is true. But what to do? It is about tariffs? I doubt. I think we have to understand that we need something extra. And that is the idea behind the International Climate Club, which has been founded and which is working now with so many countries from the Global South and more to come. Because it's the idea to cooperate when we have the same ambitions, though we are following different paths to get there. And doing this, I think, is a very important aspect for world economy to be safe when this big change all over the world is taking place. I think also it is important that we understand that it is not just about development aid and international climate financing, which is necessary, and I said it must be huge and we must stick to the things we say. It's also important that we make it that businesses are investing in the countries of Asia, of Africa and South America. If they don't do so, we will not have enough means just with public subsidies to get where we want to go. And creating an atmosphere where this works, I think, is very important. And especially looking to Africa, I think the compact with Africa is the idea that is working into this direction. And I'm very happy to see many of you in this meeting we will have in Berlin with the compact in Africa, which is important. I would like to repeat what I had the chance to say yesterday. I think we also have to understand that there is a need for change in trade policies and the way how we act. And one of the aspects is about exploration, excavation. There are a lot of resources spread all over the world. But the way the global economy is dealing with them is that we take them from the ground and then bring them to countries and work there. Yes, a lot of things will be done in countries where there is a lot of industry to work with, but I think the first refinement should be done in the countries where the resources are. This would create jobs and growth and gives the chance that we also invest in the environment over there and for also especially looking at indigenous people and others, because otherwise it is just a story of some people becoming rich using the resources. It should be something that is happening at the places where the resources are. And let me continue with what the next question, which bothers me a lot, especially looking at the consequences of the Russian aggression against Ukraine. We learn from this war, not just about the dangers to our peace, security arrangements, but also that there is just a very few countries producing fertilizers that are so important for the world. And though the natural resources and the economic abilities are there in Africa, for instance, or the South of America, or in many Asian countries to produce fertilizers, it's still monopolized by a very small number of countries. And I think discussing about fair development should include the idea of creating factories for fertilizers all over the globe so that we have a more resilient structure and that we can help many people to get there. So my view is we have to take our responsibility for the globe. We have to stick to our words. We have to walk as we talk. But if we do so, I think there's a good chance that we make our place a better world. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Olaf.
Well, thank you very much, Olaf.
Je vais demander au président Hichilema peut-être de revenir sur
come back and talk about these topics and our debt issues. And I would like to congratulate him on the agreement that was passed to renegotiate Zambia's debt. Mr. President, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, President Macron, and for hosting us and for everything else that my colleagues have already mentioned. So thank you. I also want to thank all of us, heads of state and government that are present here, and our partners, our own institutions, multilateral institutions, and obviously I do appreciate that we have other stakeholders that are here, so thank you very much. Let me be abusive a little bit, President Macron, and start by doing what is necessary on behalf of our people of Zambia, to thank greatly the achievement that was scored yesterday. One of the deliverables for this summit, and President Macron is aware, I came down here and requested that, obviously also the President of China, that we should ensure that by the time this summit takes place, we'll have delivered the Zambia debt restructuring project. And as at yesterday, this is one of the deliverables at this summit. Thank you to China. Thank you to France for chairing the G20 framework. Thank you to South Africa for being the deputy chair for this process, and also to all of the countries that in one way or another supported this process to reach the conclusion it did yesterday, and the benefit it would deliver to other debtor countries, because Zambia was more or less used like a guinea pig. And we are now in this situation, and we hope that the lessons of that process can be learned and learned correctly and be applied to the other processes that will commence starting, I believe, following this summit. I must give special thank you to the US government for their support, European Union for their support. Indeed, most of us as debtor countries also were speaking to each other, learning from each other. Thank you very much. Let me move quickly to the issue of, I can't forget creditors. Creditors. Thank you so much to the creditors, all of you, diversified as you are. Obviously, some are large, some are smaller, but without your cooperation, this was not going to be possible. But I must also say thank you to the people of Zambia for their patience. We took this project as one of our responsibilities before we formed government as an opposition party, that debt restructuring was a critical deliverable for us. And the people of Zambia were very patient, extremely patient, pain on the other side because of the structural adjustment, the structural processes. And if there's one lesson that I want to share with other countries, that leadership is crucial at the country level. To be clear of what you want and say so to your people. The people may not support everything that's necessary. Institutional reform, consumption expenditure controls. I dare say habits of corruption are enjoyed by many in our countries. And when you put reforms, you confront them as well. But it's important to be intentional as leaders and then deliver that to our communities. They will go through the pain, but they will support you, as Zambians have done that. Thank you very much to the people of Zambia. Let me put context to this. Poverty, climate change. We have already argued that these are intertwined. There's no question about it. Let me draw the first aspect of the connection. Even before we talk about financing, new financing, more financing, when countries are not growing economically, you cannot expect a poor person to carry an additional burden. That is necessary to drive growth, to drive development. So poverty actually exacerbates the climate change mitigation measures, I argue. And it's very clear. If you are asking your poor people to switch energy sources, can they afford? From charcoal to clean energy. They're already stressed. So we need to find mechanisms to support the poor in our countries, less privileged. I had this word called poverty, the poor, but the less privileged, to be able to come through to support the changes that are required to mitigate climate change negative effects. I think that's very, very important. It's also true to say climate change, on the flip side, has imposed new obligations on the less privileged. For example, the farmer you saw, the farmer you went to visit, Secretary Yellen, Treasury Secretary Yellen, before they could on 1 hectare produce, 2 hectares produce enough for themselves and an excess for sale. But climate change measures have made it one season, the same rain season, one part of it is a drought. When the rain comes, it's a flood. One season. What chance does that farmer have? They absolutely don't have. So as we talk about climate change mitigations, financing, support, technology, farming methods, issues of genetics in agriculture, early maturing varieties, I'm just giving an example. Context are important to consider. So it's not just laying the resource envelope on the table. It is digging inside that envelope. How do we apply that envelope in order to take care of the challenges that have arisen from climate change? And therefore the investments being directed in those specific areas that will produce results that will assist the less privileged to first produce food for themselves, to also produce excess for revenue to look after their households. But also it's important to look at water harvesting as an area of investment, to look at irrigation. Chairman Chancellor, the technology comes in and it's all there, it's available around the world. It's a question of pulling it together and targeting it. Let me also indicate here one of the lessons of our debt restructuring that is applicable to poverty reduction, to climate change, is the issue around speed at which we do things. G20 framework, when we took office 21 months ago, this discussion was already in train. Now we've been in office 21 months. Yes, we're very pleased that it happened yesterday. But for the countries that are coming after us, there is need to expedite the processes. Just that, whether it's, if you like, energy transition, as Senegal is involved in that, we must just be conscious of time. Every day we don't deliver these things that are within our control, we are basically increasing the cost and the damage gets compounded. I think it's very important. The next lesson I want to suggest here, relevant to the subject on the table, is that German Chancellor's point yesterday at dinner, repeated today, is so important for us as a global community to mobilize resources, yes, but these resources must be invested to help grow the economies of the less developed countries. Very important, because by doing that we are creating capacity in those economies to mitigate against climate change and obviously poverty reduction. So value addition, not just with the electric vehicle industry that is coming through, huge industry. It is important, President Macron, that we look at deliberately investing in extraction, critical minerals, for example, in value adding these minerals in country. Obviously that will help the growth side of the GDP, create jobs, business opportunities for the transactional chain in there, if I may call it that. So I think this must be deliberate as well. Rather than generic discussions, we must dive deep into the envelope and begin to say, these are requirements, these are needs, these are minimums. And it will mutually benefit, as somebody said yesterday, not to polarize the conversation, the North and the South. It would definitely, if it's structured properly, benefit the North, the South. And that's not the debate we must be engaging in, but mutuality for greater good, for a safe world, for a world that we can pass on to the next generation in a responsible manner. Lastly, I simply want to indicate that I like the spirit of partnership that I hear. I like what I hear from leaders, all of you who have spoken. I think that's the way it should be. But the thing is now to pull all this in one basket, draw an action plan, which is time-bound, and we get a job done. If the political leadership is there, business leadership is there, decisions are clear, we now need to get our technical people not to sit on the work that needs to be done. So supervision, monitoring is important. Lastly, and this is the last one really, I want to thank what I hear from the Chinese Premier, what I hear from Secretary Yellen, and indeed all the leaders that have spoken on the issue of conflict. We cannot achieve what we want to achieve if we allow our global community to focus time, resources, everything, technology, on conflict. I think there's a duty for us all to keep our individual countries peaceful, out of conflict, and not export instability to other countries, neighboring or far away. As we now know, instability anywhere is instability everywhere. I think it's very important that we work on that issue and focus the resources, focus the time, and all the other capital provisions on the development agenda to mitigate climate change, to reduce poverty. And I must also indicate here, the cost of capital must sit in this basket, that it must be lowered. The inequity around the cost of capital, Africa, for example, pays the highest cost of capital, is not correct. It doesn't help anybody at all. It just worsens the situation. We must address this situation. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, President. Je vais maintenant donner la parole au président du Brésil, Lula, et puis une demande de Cyril Ramaphosa pour Afrique du Sud. Président, sur votre vision justement de cette transformation de l'architecture et du système financier international pour traiter à la fois la question de la pauvreté et du climat. La parole est à toi.
Primeiro, eu queria cumprimentar o presidente Emmanuel Macron,
Let me
presidente da República Francesa,
salute the President of the French Republic, Emmanuel Macron, on whose behalf I also greet all of the heads of state and government participating at this high-level meeting. I should also like to greet the ex-president of Brazil and now the president of the BRICS Bank, with whom I also salute all of the representatives of development banks and other banks present here. I am speaking, of course, of Ms. Dilma Rousseff. I should like to say to you, Mr. Macron, that since yesterday evening, I have changed my speech. I went to Italy. I prepared a speech and I've changed it 10 times and I'm not going to use it, I'm not going to read it out. I would like, however, to sound the alarm on something very important. In 2025, we'll be holding COP30 in a country of the Amazon basin. And I hope that everyone who loves Amazonia, who greatly admires Amazonia, who says that it's the lungs of the world, I hope that those same people will participate in COP30 in Paraná State so they can have an idea of what Amazonia is. Because many people talk about Amazonia, but few people have actually been there. It's important to know what Amazonia is. In Brazil, Amazonia represents 5 million square kilometers. And beyond that vast surface area, we also have Amazonia in Ecuador, in Colombia, in Peru, in Venezuela, in Bolivia, and also in Guyana, and Suriname. And of course, French Guiana. So we will, on August 14th, organize a great meeting in Pará State with all of the presidents of the Latin American region making up the Amazonian basin so that we can set forth a proposal for COP28 in the United Arab Emirates. We'll be having discussions with Congo and Indonesia because what we would like would be to share and have a single proposal from countries that have great forest areas. And we want to make this heritage not simply in environmental terms, but also economically speaking, to help people who live in forests. In the Brazilian forest, we have 400 indigenous peoples, and of these, or rather, these speak 300 different languages. In the same region, there are many problems and difficulties, especially organized crime. There's often people who act in very bad faith and act in such a way that the forest is cut down and planted with soybeans or corn, or that cattle is raised there, whereas it's not necessary to do any of that. The business leaders responsible for this know that this is happening. They know they're doing bad things. They know that this will create serious problems, even with products that are meant to sell to other countries. That's the first thing I wanted to say to you. Brazil is a country which has an energy mix which is the cleanest in the world. In terms of electricity, 87% of our energy is renewable, whereas in the rest of the world the figure is more like 27%. For energy as a whole, 50% of Brazilian renewable energy is renewable, whereas in the rest of the world we see more like 15%. And that means that we are on the right path. We're going to meet our campaign pledge of zero deforestation by 2030. We're not only talking about Amazonia, but also about other biomes, the Pantanal, Caatinga, the Cerrado, the Atlantic forest. There are 5 major biomes that we must look after, all of which are being attacked year in, year out. There are fires, sometimes there's excessive rainfall. There are also human predators who plant things that are not meant to be planted in these regions. Over and above Amazonia, I should also like to talk, and over above climate issues, we need to talk about inequality in the world. It's not possible in a meeting bringing together heads of state and government that we not talk about inequalities of wages, of race, of sex and gender, of education and health. We have a world which is becoming increasingly unequal, and more we see wealth being concentrated in the hands of those who are already the richest, and that poverty is also becoming ever greater. So these inequalities need to be talked about. They should be as great a priority as climate issues. We can talk about, or we can't talk about climate problems as long as problems of inequality have not been dealt with. When I was president of my country from 2003 to 2010, and then President Dilma from 2010 to 2016, the United Nations recognized that Brazil had come out of hunger, and at that time we acted in such a way that 36 million people left absolute poverty and 40 million people enter the middle class. 13 years later, I am president again, and there are 33 million people who are going hungry. When I left the presidency, Brazil was the 6th largest economy in the world, and today it is the 12th largest. All of this is to say that we have fallen back in the same way as many other countries have. That depends obviously on the government which is elected and the social priorities of such governments. We do have to say very clearly of what has been created after the Second World War. The Bretton Woods institutions are no longer functioning and no longer correspond to the aspirations nor the interests of our societies. And we need to say that very clearly. The World Bank is not meeting the world's expectations. And we need to say this very clearly. The IMF as well is not meeting the world's expectations. And very often banks lend money because governments are failing. This is what we're seeing in Argentina presently. Argentina very irresponsibly, or IMF very irresponsibly made Argentina a huge loan. And we don't know what the Argentine president did with that money. And today, Argentina is in a very difficult economic situation because it doesn't have enough dollars to pay the IMF back. It's very important for us to realize that we cannot go on working with the same institutions working in this incorrect way. And the same thing goes for the United Nations Security Council. We can't simply reproduce policies of a past time. The representatives of 1945 are not the same ones we need today. The United Nations needs to change. It needs to become more representative. The United Nations was able to create the State of Israel in 1948, but it is not able to solve the problem of the occupation of the State of Palestine. We need to say that. So if we do not change these institutions, climate issues will just be a joke, really. Why do I say this? Because who is going to respect the decisions made by the fora that we organize? We need to be clear. Who is going to make commitments to or apply the Kyoto Protocol? Who is going to respect the decisions of COP10 in Copenhagen, the Paris Agreement? This is to say that we cannot respect those commitments because there is no strong world governance. If each and every one of us leaves these meetings or agreements and go back to our own countries, they won't be approved. So we need to say very clearly that if we don't change our institutions, the world will remain the same. And the rich will go on being rich and the poor will go on being poor. That's what happens. And I'm saying this with great sorrow because I have considerable experience of governance for the poor. And I always say the problem isn't the poor. The poor are always the solution when you put them into a country's budget. But if you act as if they're not there, if you put everything else in the budget, You will never have money to deal with people who are living in great poverty because they have no unions, they don't demonstrate, they don't have movements, they live far from centers of government, and they'll always be left to their own devices because inequality is growing. I've been hearing for almost 20 years about 900 million people in the world who will go to bed hungry. And the situation does not change. How can we fix this if we don't even put the situation on our agenda? How can we repair inequalities if they're not on the agendas of our meetings? I would say, Mr. Macron, that the world political class only gives value to poor people at election time, because poor people are a country's most important heritage, but after elections, they're forgotten and left to fend for themselves. So, I congratulate you for this meeting. I was made familiar with an African Union project which was talking about an investment of $360 million investment in infrastructure on the whole African continent. If the developed world finances companies to build infrastructure according to this plan, Africa will reach a new level in terms of infrastructure. We heard from the President of Congo about the Congo River. And this river could host 3 Brazilian power plants, but he can't do this because he hasn't got the money. And we don't want to be preaching about how funds are to be used. People say, I might help people do this and that, but in fact, what we need to do is have a qualitative leap. We need to invest in infrastructure and things which really change people's lives. The creation of BRICS, of other banks, of trading currencies, the WTO. I ask myself why we've given up on this. There were elections in the United States in 2009. President Bush have left these banks at that time. And I thought that Obama was going to recreate these institutions, but the WTO isn't doing a lot today. And that's why we have the problems that we have. You remember the London G20. So as to avoid rich countries making investments in poor countries. What happened? And it was the return of protectionism. And what do we see today? What we see is a return of poverty on all continents. Let's take the case of Brazil. I was very proud no longer to be on the map of hunger when President Dilma took over. And now I've come back to being president, and I see very sadly that in a democratic level, we're in a much worse situation because of the fascists who governed us before. And in education as well, we're much worse off because we're no longer investing in universities. And on the social level, it's much worse because there was no longer any social policy. On the economic level, it's worse as well. And today, we need to get back to work. Redo everything we did. Everything we accomplished in 2000 and 2016 will have to start over again so the country gets back on the path to growth. And the only thing I wanted to say to you in the course of this meeting is that the climate issue is not a secondary one. And Brazil will effectively get a handle on deforestation. It is a matter of honor for us to say that by 2030 there will no longer be any deforestation in Amazonia. We have 30 million hectares of land that has been degraded. You don't need to cut down a tree to plant corn or soybeans or to raise cattle. Damaged lands must be restored, and we also have to think about our international agreements for trade, for the environment. We have to be working with just instruments. All I dream of is having an agreement with the European Union. But this won't be possible as long as we have this additional burden that the European Union is demanding. We're not going to be able to sign an agreement in these conditions. I've asked for an answer, and I'm waiting for this answer. How can we have a strategic partnership with threats being made against a strategic partner? How do you expect us to sign an agreement in these circumstances? If I could, I would take Chancellor Scholz and I would make a Minister of Mines and Industry in my country so that we could transform our situation, so that all of the ore in our country could be processed in my country. That was the best thing we heard yesterday at dinner and this morning, because it's true, after all, that we are exporters of raw materials, and we don't hold on to any of the things we produce. In many places in the world, firms that mine ore do not have reforestation. They just dig holes and then off they go somewhere else. So I will say to you, I've come back to being president of my country after so many years, and you know that I'm 77 years old. I'm 77. But my will is to do things and to abandon someone who has 30 years of existence here. I will tell you that I will invite you, Olaf Scholz, to Amazonia so that you can see that deforestation has been reduced to zero. And once again, we will suppress hunger. Dilma knows perfectly well what we did to eliminate hunger. And she is now president of the BRICS Bank. She can prepare all the necessary papers to be signed to give loans to Brazil and many other countries, because we really changed things. Some people are afraid, I think, when they hear me say that we need to create a new currency for trading. I don't know why Brazil and Argentina need to trade in dollars. Why shouldn't we do this in our own currencies? Why should Brazil and China not be able to trade using their own currencies? Why do I need to buy dollars? That is a subject that is on my agenda. And if it was up to me and me alone, we would discuss this at the next BRICS meeting, which will happen in September. And at the G20 meeting as well, because there we're going to need to have more African colleagues participating in the G20, just as you're having it happen at the G7 meetings. These fora cannot be a club for the happy few, for the political elite. We need to bring different people, people suffering from inequality, because we need to realize that these problems are everyone's problems. We're all following a parameter, an example. Look at what happened in the European Union, President Macron. You know this. I think that the construction of the European Union is democratic heritage. After 2 world wars, you managed to construct, to build this European Union, a parliament, and to go on living with your own divergences, just having democratic discussions. And that's what I want for South America. We need this. The African Union is much better organized than we are in Latin America, and we can organize ourselves. And we can create new trade blocs to negotiate with the European Union. But excuse me here, the World Bank, the IMF, but I think you really have to have a good look at the way you work. You need more money. You need to have new orientations, more participants in your management. You shouldn't always have the same little closed club from 1945, 46, 47, 48. Dear Emmanuel Macron, thank you for this meeting, and please be prepared, because I am back and with a will to fight even harder than I did 13 years ago. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup, Président.
Thank you so much, President.
Rendez-vous est pris pour l'Amazonie.
See you in Amazonia then.
J'ai peut-être donné la parole à Cyril
Maybe
Ramaphosa
I'll give
avant
the
de conclure.
floor to Cyril Ramaphosa before we wind up.
Thank you very much, President Macron. Let me start off by saying, President Lula, don't worry, when we have the BRICS meeting, the issue of currency is top on the agenda, so we are going to discuss it. President Macron, I just want to start off on a very positive note in terms of what I think is evolving here. I think there is consensus that is clearly embraced by everyone that we need to address climate and poverty because they go together. There's a nexus. And as it were, we need to burn the candle on both sides. So that's important. So that's agreed. And we all recognize and accept that we need capital at scale to address the key challenges that many countries in the world face, particularly the developing economy countries. And we also would be agreed that there needs to be more cooperation and coordination between your development banks, multilateral development banks, and the private sector. There needs to be coordination so that there is no fragmentation, which you kept talking about. But I think what is important to many of us is that there should be solid consensus on the reform of the financial architecture of the world. Because without that reform, the dreams and the objectives that we have to address our challenges will not be realized. And those reforms need to touch on a whole range of issues. Mr. Mo Ibrahim yesterday even spoke about something that we may think is insignificant, that the boards of directors of your multilateral institutions are not made up of independent directors. They are largely internal people or shareholders. So that in itself, for us, it's an important reform. We also need to look at the distribution of the special drawing rights. I find it a bit difficult to be told that this is set in the rules and it will forever be like that, and that it's either you get 0 or you get 34 billion. In our view, this is not a zero-sum game. It's a game where we all need to be dealt with equity in an equitable manner. And there is a need for reform in that regard as well. And the other important thing for this to happen, it will help us not to participate as unequal cousins in these institutions. It will help us to participate fully, and so that we don't have a sense that we are beggars, that we are being dealt with out of generosity. I think it's important in the new era that the world is in now that there should be a good measure of equality among sovereign nations. You know, recently, 7 African countries decided to go and put a call for peace to Ukraine and to Russia. And we raised a number of issues. Zambia was represented, Comoros was represented, Republic of Congo was represented, Senegal was represented, Uganda
as well as South Africa. So we were all represented, and Egypt as well. So we were all at one, that even as we were going to address an issue of the war which has had a negative impact on the African continent, which is the rise in prices for food, rise in prices for fertilizers, we were clear that we are not going there as beggars. We are not going to ask for a favor to both Ukraine and Russia. We were going there to say, open up the Black Sea Channel so that the grains and the fertilizers should go into the world market. So we were not on a begging mission, even as we are in great need as a continent and all that. That should go to demonstrate that Africa should never be seen as a continent that needs generosity. We want to be treated as equals. Even in the multilateral institutions, we want to be treated as equals. And if our equity is at a low ebb, there must be ways in which that can be addressed. To us, this is very important. Our sovereignty is one of the things that we hold on dearly to. And we demonstrated that very clearly to both President Zelensky and to President Putin when it came to this issue. Even as there were suggestions that, yes, we can donate this, we can donate that, we said, we want you to release these grains and fertilizers to the world market so that the world can trade in these commodities and other issues we can handle in a different way. I wanted to make that point so that it should be understood where Africa has evolved up to. We want to be key players on the world stage, want to be key players even in the financial markets and in the MDBs. Now, these are the positive things. I do, Mr. President Macron, want us to address another issue which to us is a bit of a negative. You will have heard President Sisi talking about the 100 billion that was promised in Paris. President Sassou Nguesso yesterday as well also spoke about it at the dinner. Now there is that issue that a number of the commitments that have been made have not really been fully lived up to. But before I get into details, let me immediately say that we recognize the many initiatives that have been put on the table, and a number of countries here have done so. Germany has gone out of the way to put a number of initiatives, and the US has also done a number of things. But there have been times when we felt like we were beggars. I played a key role as chair of the African Union during the COVID period. We felt like we were beggars when it came to vaccine availability, when we felt we needed access to vaccines, and the Northern Hemisphere countries had bought all the vaccines in the world, and they were hogging them. And they didn't want to release them at the time when we needed them most. And we felt like we were begging. And at times it felt like they would just be droppings from the table, that yes, we will give you that and that. And let me tell you something that generated a lot of resentment. We resented that, and it got worse when we said we want to manufacture our own vaccines. And when we went to the WTO, there was a lot of resistance, enormous resistance. And we kept saying, what is more important, life or profits by your big pharmaceutical companies? And that too, I must tell you now, generated and deepened that disappointment and resentment on our part, because we felt like Life in the Northern Hemisphere is much more important than life in the Global South. And these are issues that need to be addressed. And I'm glad that we are all seated here like this, because we've got to get to the heart of these matters and address them. Now, I come to promises that have been made. And Chancellor Scholz was saying, we've got to walk the talk. Yes, we want to see the talk being walked. President Sassou Nguesso yesterday said at the dinner, $100 billion was promised per year. And he was saying, I've never seen that. And many of us will testify that that $100 billion has never really been made available. And this should stand out as something that needs to be addressed. Because sometimes we sit at conferences like this and say, yes, we'll make this available, and we believe you. We believe you, but now the tire must hit the tar. We must now see action flowing from that. Now, I want to then talk about something very practical. President Sassou Nguesso raised it yesterday. He said he would be happy if flowing from this summit, we do something very practical on the infrastructure side. Having said that 600 million people in Africa do not have electricity, and yet we've got all the resources to generate electricity, particularly the mighty Congo River, and that there have been plans to build a number of power stations that will generate, in my calculation, up to 70,000 megawatts. And he said, and I want to speak in support of this proposal, that to prove that these summits are not summits where we just talk, flowing from the Paris COP as well as others, let us now put money on the table and collectively say we are going to address this mega project. A mega project which will in the end generate electricity for up to 12, 15 African countries all at one go. And this is a project that I think the multilateral development banks here working together, the call that you've made, President Macron, can actually fund. And where, as we rise from this, we should be able to say the Inga Dam is now going to be developed into the Inga Power Station, the one that President Sassou Nguesso mentioned, and the next one as well. If we can do that, then we as Africans will now be convinced that these summits are really meaningful. We will now go home and say, you know what, it's worthwhile going to these summits, coming to Europe, and to listen to all the promises because they are willing to act on the promises. This is what President Macron, I believe, will be one of the most important outcomes. The reform of the financial architecture, as well as a practical project, infrastructure project that is going to add a lot of value. President Sisi and I have been talking about a railway from Cape Town to Cairo for years. We will leave that for the next summit, but the one on generating electricity and building power stations on the Inga Dam is the most important, that is immediate, that I believe needs to be addressed now. Let's get that done, and then we will be convinced that you are serious with the promises that you make. Thank you.
Thank you, Cyril. Thank you, everybody. Mesdames et messieurs les chefs
Ladies and
d'État et de
gentlemen,
gouvernement, mesdames
heads
et
of
messieurs,
state and of
en vos
government,
grades et
ladies and
qualités,
gentlemen, in your
il est temps
various
maintenant de
race and
conclure ce
qualities,
sommet et
we
je vais
now
essayer,
have to wind up
après les
the
discussions
summit,
d'hier,
and
le
having
dîner que nous avons
heard
eu et l'échange très fructueux qu'il y a eu ce
yesterday's
matin,
discussion, the dinner,
de
and
faire
this
une conclusion
morning's very
opérationnelle.
useful debates.
Parce
I'm
que
trying to
sinon nous nous quitterons sur des bonnes
produce what I
paroles.
would call an operational
Et il se
statement.
trouve
Otherwise,
que
it'll just be lip service.
moi aussi je
And
deviens vieux dans ce business.
I'm getting a bit old
Et
in this business
on
too.
finit maintenant par
And
nous-mêmes
I know
pratiquer
that
l'indignation répétitive où on dit
we end up
sommet après
practicing
sommet,
what we
il y en a
call
assez de parler, il faut
repetitive
faire des
indignation.
choses.
We all
On
say
arrive à avoir la
we've
même
talked enough
indignation,
after
mais
each summit, so we get
l'efficacité ne vaut que
wound
par le
up
suivi,
about it. But
par la
efficiency is
capacité
seen
à
in
rendre
your
compte
follow-up,
à
in
nos
the
sociétés civiles, aux
ability
opinions publiques,
of,
et à
that we
nous-mêmes de
have
manière
to be
régulière. C'est pour ça que je
accountable
voulais tout à l'heure
to
que la
our
directrice générale du FMI
societies and as others. This is why I wanted to hear from the DG of the IMF to find out what's been done, because you can't just say nothing's been done. We're not going fast enough, we're not intense enough, and we need to go deeper and further. Okay, so what I will try to talk about some lines of action. What is our new consensus with respect to peoples and the planet? That's what we're talking about here. Firstly, I think we all agree, because this is what I've heard. I'm just the note taker, the scribe here. I think we all agree that the target is a world without poverty. We rightly got indignant about that. It was enough of inequalities. That's what, number 6, isn't it? Yes. Enough with inequalities. So let's get rid of poverty and preserve our planet. And we want a world where the most vulnerable countries are better equipped to deal with crises and climate change and conflicts. That's the Bridgetown agenda. So those are the consensus-based targets, and we have a clear strategy for that. We want to draw on all sources of funding, public development aid, national resources, multilateral institutions, banks, and private funding. I think we all agree on that. Second big thing, in order to achieve these targets, what emerges from this, and I think this is what we're all illustrating, we have to stick together. There's a huge risk of institutions being fragmented. I think this was said yesterday. I think it was Nigeria at the meeting, at the dinner rather. So to avoid fragmentation, we have to have a deep reform of the governments of the international financial architecture to make it more efficient, effective, more equitable, and better suited today's world. There's a full consensus there. We need to get down and work on that right away. Then there are 4 work streams I think we've identified. First, no country shall have to choose between combating poverty and protecting the planet. Secondly, the appropriation of transition strategies has to be done at country level. There are different requirements. Countries can follow their own paths, whether talking about energy, protecting forests, climate, nature, etc. Thirdly, we need a financing shock with more public funding, and also need more injection of private capital so as to transfer emerging and developing economies, to take us to the targets of reducing equality and so saving our planet. In general terms, what we need is strong financial contributions, and there are some short-term solutions identified, in addition to what we've heard from Senegal and Zambia that say they're national successors. And I'm saying this for Anna because this has now been put down in writing. We have achieved the 100 billion SDR target. So the Paris call of 2 years ago, because we've seen from the follow-up, has now been materialized by a formal commitment. So it's either 100 billion SDRs or budget equivalents for those who didn't want to do it for whatever reason, for the most vulnerable countries, in particular in Africa. As of now, we have 61 billions in the IMF, and we're now going to, over the next few months, keep working to ensure that the remaining 2030, where commitments have been made, actually reach people's coffers. Projects have been negotiated. Several dozen others will be completed in the next few weeks. We're going to set up a framework so that we can use these SDRs or equivalents to reinforce the equity of regional development banks. So that's a task we'll be working on to make sure this can be allocated to the development banks, which will make everything more efficient and effective. And this will change people's lives. Fourth thing that we've noted progress on, although it's not sufficient, I agree. Our experts are telling us that as of now, we are getting close to 100 billion funding for the climate, the result of the Paris Agreement. And we've been much slower there, much less effective than with the SDR allocations. So we need much closer, more hands-on operational follow-up to this 100 billion for the climate, because where we are at the moment is not satisfactory. And I suggest we ask for a special report over and above any statement made for COP28 at the end of the year. Third thing, to be more effective, we have a consensus to say that each dollar lent by MDBs should be accompanied by at least the same amount of private funding. On that basis, we're expecting 100 billion in private funds mobilized each year in emerging and developing countries. Maybe we're more ambitious. We were saying it's simply so we can go beyond, but this at least has to be locked in. Fourth short-term agreement area, we expect an overall increase of $200 billion lending capacity of MDBs, as said by Secretary Ellen just now, over the next few years. That's a result of all the work that's been done working with institutions, optimizing our balance sheets, and we have decided that we all want that now, and we know that the multilateral banks will probably be able to lend more on that basis. This means that we're going to launch a monitoring exercise with the sort of infrastructure both that the South African Premier said, so that key infrastructure projects in Africa can be implemented, and that will be part of our follow-up. A fifth short-term target will be speeding up debt processing in the common framework we've decided. This was done for Chad a couple of years ago, for Zambia yesterday, and I'd like to thank you for raising this today. We will speed up the tackling of the debt problem. For Ghana and other countries, for example, we see that we have to provide mutual support when we're hit by a catastrophe. So we'll set up special tools, including a climate-resistant debt clause. So there's an agreement for all countries that will join the consensus that there should be what's requested in the Bridgetown agenda, make sure that multilateral banks can include that in their statutes. And of course, we call for two actions to be mobilized. Two forms of coordination. The Climate Club that Chancellor Scholz mentioned in the framework of the OECD to coordinate countries' efforts with respect to climate and climate financing. And yesterday, we started the Financing Common Network with all the public development banks and MDBs that will enable us to coordinate. And then finally, other things will be done in cooperation with the chairs of G20 and COP. And I'll just go through the list so that we can remember what was said yesterday evening and today. New ideas for international taxation in those sectors that are benefiting most from globalization, to respect our commitments and step up the fight against poverty and protecting the planet. So we will try to improve the most concessionary lending from the World Bank. Thirdly, inclusion of climate vulnerability in debt viability assessment by the IMF and World Bank so that we can better take into account the need to combat climate change. Then we will reduce excessive risks, in particular exchange risks, as emerged in various roundtables. Then a new fund, international funding facility for forests will be set up so as to pay for ecosystem processes so that we can help the countries concerned. What that means is a nature fund, which is to be finalized at COP at the end of the year, and will need that will be able to support countries when they work for their biodiversity, for countries like Gabon, Indonesia, Brazil, Cambodia and others, in order to protect their biodiversity and protect their natural resources as we go forward. And then sixth point is that we will set up a working mechanism so as to make the most of raw materials extracted from developing and emerging economy countries so that we can have a value change that will create jobs and increase GDP in the countries, in those areas of competence. And we commit to taking forward the work we've done with health and food so as to reinforce countries' sovereignty. In March 2020, I'm sure Cyril remembers, this is why we set up the ACTA initiative with Tedros and the African Union, and then G20. And this meant that we could develop common resources for Africa, and then with Cyril and William's predecessor in Kenya, we worked on vaccine production capacity in Africa. It's 20% of the need, but 2% of the production, so we need to do more. We've tried to increase vaccine production in Africa, as was said, the same with agricultural capabilities and fertilizers, but we need infrastructure in all countries that can build value chains in their special areas. And as requested by President Akafala, we will have a monitoring system involving the African Union in all the areas that they want to cover all the commitments made today. So what I've said here will be circulated among all of you. All of those who wish to formally sign up to it will be able to do so. So I'm the notary of this, if you like. If you don't want to take it as is, can add some things. But I think we need to shape a new consensus for our peoples and planet. We should have a report every 6 months, taking into account public opinion and the views of young people. And you know, there's a lot of contribution from CSOs, and we will have a proper monitoring system for them. And we want a 6-monthly report. And what I suggest is that on the way to COP, to be organized by Lula, and next year you'll have presidency of G20 at the Amazonian COP. We will do things, and we hope, and we have to have 2 years from now a meeting to review all of that. I think it's important to have commitments. Well, I'm as energetic as you, but we also have to be able to take stock of what we've done and see why we haven't achieved everything. I think it's a very pragmatic and perhaps rather plodding method, but it's the only way that we can be held fully accountable. A lot has been said. I hope I've covered everything, including the expectations of President Sisi. So we have a new consensus now, and I hope all of you here will sign up to that because it's ours. I have just spelt it out for you because I took the notes and I'm explaining what I think we agreed. And I hope on the basis of today's consensus we can transform lives, help countries improve, and use our indignation to make sure that people's lives can change. Thank you all, and let's go for it because we're all committed to this. Thank you so much.